The year she turned 67, Margaret stopped recognizing her own body. She had been a woman of routine her entire life, a school teacher for 34 years, a grandmother who never missed a birthday, a woman who prided herself on resilience. But that year, something shifted in a way she couldn't explain. Something that felt less like aging and more like disappearing. The tiredness came first. Not the ordinary fatigue that follows a restless night or a busy week. This was different. Margaret described it as a heaviness, a sensation of wading through water from the moment she opened her eyes. She would sleep for 8 hours, sometimes 9, only to wake feeling as if she had run a marathon in her dreams. Her husband noticed the change before she fully acknowledged it. The way she would sit down to catch her breath after a simple task like folding laundry. The way her eyes would glaze over during conversations. She told herself it was just age, a natural consequence of 67 years of life. She didn't want to be the person who complained about getting older. She had always hated that. When she finally mentioned it to her doctor, she was met with a routine that felt almost rehearsed. Blood work ordered, thyroid checked. Results came back, nothing alarming, just slightly low on iron. Her doctor prescribed supplements. She took them faithfully. Her levels barely budged. A second doctor suggested she was probably just stressed. Retirement can be disorienting, you know. The loss of identity, the disruption to routine. Margaret thought that was quite generous, considering she had never felt better about her life than when she stopped grading papers. She agreed to try melatonin for her sleep. It didn't help. She started noticing other things. A persistent sensation of bloating that would vanish for a week and then return with surprising ferocity. There was a pattern to it that she couldn't quite map. 3 days of discomfort followed by days of normalcy, then back again. She adjusted her diet. She ate more probiotics. She stopped eating certain foods entirely. The bloating came and went regardless. She also noticed her skin had started to behave strangely, patches of dryness that flared up into an almost unbearable itch, mostly at night. She bought creams, heavier lotions, changed her soap. Nothing provided lasting relief. The itching would settle down only to reappear the following evening, a regular companion she hadn't asked for. There was something else, too. Something she was too embarrassed to mention to any doctor. An unusual itch that seemed to focus itself in one particular place. She told herself it must be hemorrhoids, a common annoyance of aging that she had read about. She didn't bring it up at her appointments because it felt too private, too awkward to discuss with a stranger. She believed it was probably unrelated anyway. She had become adept at sorting her symptoms into different mental compartments. The fatigue belonged to aging. The bloating belonged to diet. The itching belonged to dry winter air. The other thing was just something she had to manage privately. None of it seemed connected. Why would it? By the time I sat across from Margaret, she had compiled a portfolio of diagnoses and prescriptions. Iron supplements that weren't working. Sleep aids that weren't creating restful sleep. Melatonin, magnesium, probiotics, fiber supplements. She had been told she might have mild depression, possibly related to her life transition. She had tried exercising more, as recommended, and she had dutifully done that, without improvement. She had become a patient who had done absolutely everything right, and yet nothing had changed. When I asked her to walk me through her symptoms, she described them as separate issues. I noticed that pattern immediately, the way patients unconsciously separate their bodily signals into neat categories. Fatigue here, digestion there, skin somewhere else. I began drawing lines between them on a single piece of paper, a simple diagram that connected each complaint to the next. I asked her one question she had never been asked by anyone before. A question that seemed simple, but required shifting the entire frame of our conversation. When was the last time anyone investigated what was happening inside your gut? Not with a colonoscopy, not with a culture for common bacteria, but with something specific, a proper search for organisms that might be living there without belonging. Margaret looked at me with confusion. It was clear she had never entertained that possibility. She had never traveled to tropical countries. She lived in a suburb with clean water and modern plumbing. She didn't fit the image she had in her mind of someone who would need that kind of test. She assumed that kind of thing happened to other people, people who lived elsewhere, people in less sanitary conditions, not a retired school teacher in a comfortably insulated home. That assumption is one of the most persistent and dangerous gaps I have encountered in years of clinical practice. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 1.5 billion people carry soil-transmitted helminths, a category that includes roundworms, hookworms, and whipworms at any given moment. That number does not include protozoal infections like Giardia lamblia or Entamoeba histolytica, organisms that are routinely detected in municipal water supplies and food processing systems across North America and Europe. Giardia alone is the most commonly diagnosed intestinal parasite in the United States. It is found in lakes, rivers, swimming pools, municipal water systems, and even in the irrigation water used for fresh produce. It is not a disease of distant places. It is an organism that thrives in the proximity of modern life. When we tested Margaret, I ordered a comprehensive stool examination that included multiple samples collected over several days. Parasites do not shed consistently. They have reproductive cycles and feeding cycles that generate biological rhythms. A single sample collected on a single day can produce a false negative, even in an active infection, which is why proper testing requires multiple samples to capture the organism during its shedding phase. Margaret's results came back positive for a parasitic infection that had been quietly living in her intestine for who knows how long, competing with her own body for nutrients, consuming energy, altering her digestion, and triggering inflammatory signals that made her skin itch at night. This is the overlooked reality that most people never encounter because the right question is rarely asked. The gastrointestinal tract is an ecological system, not a simple tube. It is a complex territory inhabited by trillions of microorganisms, a landscape that is constantly in negotiation with the food we eat, the water we drink, and the organisms we inadvertently consume. The lining of the small intestine, if spread flat, covers roughly the surface area of a tennis court, a vast expanse of absorptive tissue covered in finger-like projections called villi. These structures are responsible for capturing every nutrient that enters your system: iron, vitamin B12, zinc, magnesium, fat-soluble vitamins. They are also the front-line defenders of your bloodstream, a barrier that determines what enters your body and what remains in the digestive tract for elimination. Consider what happens when an organism settles into this environment without permission. Hookworms attach directly to the intestinal wall and feed on blood. A moderate burden can produce daily blood loss significant enough to cause iron deficiency anemia that persists despite oral supplementation. The iron is being consumed before it can reach your bloodstream. You are taking supplements, but the supplements are being partially consumed by something else. Tapeworms are particularly efficient at consuming vitamin B12, a nutrient essential for energy production and neurological function. Patients often present with borderline B12 levels that do not normalize despite supplementation, because the vitamin is being absorbed first by the organism colonizing their intestine. Protozoa, like Giardia, operate differently. They create a physical coating over the absorptive surface of the small intestine, effectively insulating your villi from the nutrients passing by. This produces a broader pattern of malabsorption that can affect fat, fat-soluble vitamins, and carbohydrates. The infection also disrupts the tight junction proteins that seal intestinal cells together, microscopic barriers that keep the contents of your gut inside the gut. When those seals weaken, inflammatory molecules enter your bloodstream and trigger systemic responses. Fatigue, cognitive fog, immune dysregulation. These are not diseases in isolation. They are consequences of a compromised ecosystem. The signaling loop is what most people miss, and this is where the story becomes important. Parasites deplete nutrients. Nutritional depletion weakens the immune response. A weaker immune response allows the organism to persist longer and reproduce more effectively. More organisms generate more inflammation. More inflammation damages the gut lining further. A damaged gut lining absorbs fewer nutrients. Nutrient deficiencies produce more fatigue, more fog, more irregularity. The body continues sending signals, persistent and specific, but those signals are often interpreted as separate problems. Fatigue gets a supplement. Skin irritation gets a cream. Mood changes get a prescription. The underlying cause continues its work undetected. Margaret was treated properly for the organism identified in her stool samples. Standard anti-parasitic medications are effective, well tolerated, and should always be the first line of treatment for confirmed infections. I want to be absolutely clear on that. Her treatment took time, and it required support for her gut environment afterward, a rehabilitation phase that involved dietary changes and specific nutritional support. But once the organism was addressed, her iron levels began to climb. Her sleep became genuinely restorative. The cycling digestive symptoms stopped. The itching resolved completely. She told me at a follow-up appointment that for 2 years she had been told the problem was her age. She was 67. She told me she realized she could have spent the next decade of her life believing she was simply declining, accepting a slower pace as inevitable, when the actual problem was something that could be identified and addressed. That realization changes how she experiences her body now, not as something failing, but as something communicating. I want you to understand something important about the signals your body sends. They are not ambiguous. Fatigue that does not improve with rest is a specific signal. Digestive symptoms that cycle on their own schedule are a specific signal. Nutritional deficiencies that do not resolve with supplementation are a specific signal. Skin changes that have no obvious explanation are a specific signal. The body is not being unclear. The confusion arises when we habitually sort those signals into separate categories, paying attention to each one in isolation without asking what might connect them. I want to offer you 4 major shifts in gut environment that occur after 60. And understanding these is important because they change the balance of risk. The first is gastric acid production. Stomach acid is an incredibly effective barrier, a highly acidic environment that kills many pathogens before they reach the small intestine. With age, acid production often declines, a process called hypochlorhydria. This decline is accelerated significantly by medications that many adults use daily: proton pump inhibitors and H2 blockers prescribed for reflux. These medications intentionally reduce stomach acid, which is appropriate for that specific condition. but they also reduce one of your body's primary defenses against ingested organisms. The second shift is gut motility. The rhythmic contractions that move contents through your digestive tract slow with age. Food, and anything that came with it, spends more time in your gut. That extended transit gives organisms more opportunity to establish themselves. Slower motility also contributes to the cycling digestive pattern that many patients describe, alternating constipation and loose stools that they accept as normal. The third is immunosenescence. Your immune system ages. This is not a failure, it is a change. The constant monitoring inside your gut becomes less responsive. Parasitic infections that a younger immune system might clear without producing symptoms can gain a foothold more easily after 60. The fourth shift is the microbiome itself. A diverse bacterial community creates a competitive environment that is hostile to pathogens. As we age, microbial diversity tends to decline, particularly after antibiotic use, dietary changes, or chronic stress. A less diverse microbiome is less resistant to colonization by organisms that do not belong. None of this means that everyone over 60 has a parasitic infection, but it does mean that if your body sends these signals, particularly after travel, after consuming water from an uncertain source, or after a gastrointestinal illness that never fully resolved, the threshold for investigation should be lower. You should be aware of the possibility. If you recognize several of these patterns in yourself, ask specifically for a comprehensive stool, ova, and parasite examination collected on multiple separate days. If Giardia is suspected, request a Giardia antigen test specifically. Standard stool examinations miss it in a meaningful percentage of cases. Some clinicians will be familiar with this, others will need the direct request. I know some of you hesitate to advocate in medical appointments, worried about appearing difficult. You are not being difficult when you ask for a specific test. You are giving your physician relevant clinical information and participating in your own care. The goal is not to replace a medical evaluation, but to ensure that the right questions are asked at the right time. Let me talk about supportive practices for gut health, because this is where many people want practical guidance, especially if testing is negative. The gut needs support to function as a strong ecosystem, whether or not an infection has been identified. Garlic is worth understanding. Crushed or chopped raw garlic produces a compound called allicin, which has shown activity against a range of intestinal parasites in vitro, including Giardia and certain amoeba species. For this to be relevant, the garlic needs to be raw and consumed shortly after preparation, because allicin degrades over time and cooking produces far less of it. A small amount of raw garlic incorporated into food can be a reasonable addition to a gut-supportive diet. This is not a treatment for active infection. It is a supportive measure. Pumpkin seeds have traditional use against intestinal worms across many cultures, and there is research to explain why. The active compound appears to cause temporary paralysis of certain helminths, impairing their attachment to the intestinal wall. The amounts used traditionally are significant. A handful of raw seeds consistently over time, not a sprinkle on a salad. Clove is interesting because its activity appears directed specifically against the eggs and early-stage larvae of certain parasites. Most interventions work against adult organisms. Clove is one of the few natural compounds with demonstrated activity against earlier reproductive forms. Eugenol, its primary bioactive constituent, has been studied for this specifically. The logic is that clove's role is less about eliminating adult organisms and more about disrupting the reproductive cycle. Ginger does several things simultaneously in ways that matter for gut health. It has documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. It improves gut motility, which supports the mechanical expulsion of organisms. It supports the mucosal lining in ways that appear to counter some of the barrier damage that parasitic infections cause. It is one of the most tolerable daily additions, effective in tea, cooking, or as a well-tolerated supplement, even in older adults. What I want you to understand about these compounds is that they do not work like antibiotics. They are not precise, potent, or reliable enough to serve as treatment for a confirmed infection. Used consistently over time as part of a diet that includes fiber and adequate hydration, they can make the gut environment less hospitable, support immune function, and contribute to a daily biochemical environment that is harder for organisms to exploit. Fiber deserves a separate mention because it is the most overlooked structural support. Soluble fiber from oats, flaxseed, and cooked legumes acts as scaffolding for everything the gut does. It feeds beneficial bacteria, binds waste products for elimination, and supports regular motility. Most adults over 60 consume far less fiber than their gut actually needs. I also want to give you clear guidance on when symptoms cross a threshold that requires medical attention promptly. Unintentional weight loss, alongside fatigue and digestive symptoms, warrants evaluation. Visible blood in stool, or stools that are consistently pale or greasy, warrants prompt evaluation. Fatigue severe enough to interfere with daily function is not something to manage at home. If you have recently traveled to areas with less reliable water treatment, or if you had a gastrointestinal illness that seemed to resolve but left you with persistent symptoms, that combination is a clear indication for testing. The body does not send ambiguous messages. It sends specific signals. Fatigue that does not respond to sleep is a specific signal. Digestive symptoms that cycle on their own schedule are a specific signal. Nutritional levels that do not improve with supplementation are a specific signal. These signals are not random or disconnected. They are pieces of a larger picture that requires stepping back to see. The problem is not that the body is unclear. The problem is that our standard approach sorts these signals into separate categories and misses the larger question. Margaret recovered. Not overnight. Proper treatment followed by real rehabilitation of her gut environment took time. But she got better. She no longer wakes up feeling exhausted. She no longer sees her body as something that is inexplicably failing her. She knows now that her body was trying to tell her something specific, and that when she finally understood the language, she was able to respond appropriately. That is the part I want you to hold on to. The body has its own vocabulary. It will keep repeating itself until you understand what it is saying.